with stormwater problems. And then I'm going to close out with an overview of small-scale stormwater best management practices, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. This is not a design presentation. I'm not going to tell you where to put a rain garden, how to measure, the percolation test and to size it. That's not what this is about. That would be a separate presentation, many hours long, on how to do that with probably a field practicum. Again, the idea here is how to spot how water has moved across a property so you can get a sense of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And as anybody, especially Jackie, will tell you, getting from point A to point B when you work with me is not a straight line. I'm not doing Zoom polls this evening, so you don't have to click and throw something into a Zoom box. I will have a couple of these little tongue-in-cheek sort of questions that I use as segues into different sections of the presentation that I'm covering tonight. So when I stop and say, hey, what if you saw this out in front of your house? Like I say, I throw a couple of tongue-in-cheek answers in there, but usually at least one of them is something that we're going to be talking about in a moment or two. And in this particular instance, nothing to do with the Uber or fishing, is something may have changed uphill in this community recently. And I want you to put that kind of at the back of your mind after we've gone through some of the preliminary information. So no Zoom polls tonight, but I will have a little bit of a quizzy thing coming up in just a minute. So surface or stormwater runoff is just as it kind of describes itself, that it's excess rainwater, snow melt, ice, any type of precipitation that's hit the ground that either cannot or will no longer soak into the ground because the ground is saturated. And what happens is it just begins to flow across the surface of the land. And along the way, it's going to pick up sediment. It's going to pick up nitrogen, phosphorus. It's going to pick up oils and greases, metals, things like that. And that's why we're genuinely concerned about controlling stormwater runoff wherever possible, although it is part of a natural process. And you've probably seen this slide a number of times. There's a newer version that has like 10 more steps in it. I prefer the older one that focuses on the core processes within the water or hydrologic cycle. And since we're talking about surface runoff, there are two main processes in the hydrologic cycle, I think, that really have an impact on that, and that's precipitation and infiltration. Not that some of the other processes have an impact, but these are the two that I really focus on when I'm going out and working with somebody on their property to try to address stormwater issues. So the first is precipitation, and that's anything that started in the clouds and ended up on the ground in the form of either solid or liquid water, snow, sleet, rain, hail, ice, whatever. And the kind of significance to urban or to stormwater runoff or surface runoff are those three words there: intensity, duration, and frequency. You will hear people in the climate resilience realm talk about IDF, those three particular words, and how they use those to try to calculate future changes in runoff. But intensity is just simply, how much rain falls in a given amount of time. Is it a light rain or is it a heavy sort of rain? The duration is how long did it rain? Was it a thunderstorm that passed through and lasted a few minutes? Or was it an all-day soaker that we get from kind of nor'easters and things like that? And then lastly is the frequency, or how often it rains. And again, these can have a significant impact on surface or stormwater runoff. You'll notice I got a little factoid down at the bottom. 70% returns to the atmosphere through evaporation. But 30% actually makes it into the streams and our larger water bodies, or works its way into the ground for groundwater, which is like a really great segue into the other term in the hydrologic process, infiltration. So this is just simply the downward movement of that water that was formerly in the atmosphere, either into the soil or porous rock that makes up the land beneath our feet. And kind of like precipitation, there's some key elements to surface or stormwater runoff that we really focus on, one of which is the permeability of the soil. Is the soil where the water is trying to get into, the rainwater, the snowmelt, whatever, are the soil particles compressed together, or are they spread apart and will allow the water in and the ability to move down at a pretty good rate? Soil saturation, this goes with that kind of frequency of precipitation. When did it last rain? If you go a couple of days without rain, it's usually not a problem. You may not get as much surface runoff as opposed to maybe having back-to-back days of rain. So soil saturation is a very important component because once the soil is full of water and it can no longer move down, it all becomes surface runoff. Another is slope. For those of us over on Maryland's eastern shore, much less of a consideration. To Doris and Christie and the others up in Cecil County, you do have slope. You've got Piedmont up in that area, but down this way, slope is less of a concern. But from right I-95 west, when you start getting up into the Piedmont, slope is a major consideration because as the rain hits those slopes, it does not have enough time to soak in and is going to just immediately become surface runoff. So that's a consideration. And then lastly here is cover type. Is it an impervious or pervious surface? And the impervious is going to be those sidewalks, rooftops, driveways, parking lots, and yes, even gravel areas. Gravel, when you look at it as a land cover by state and federal agencies, and when we look at things, is considered an impervious surface. As opposed to pervious surfaces, wooded areas, lawn practices, areas that may have a practice that allows the water to intentionally soak into the ground would be pervious surfaces. The little diagram over there, again, we had 30% that kind of make it into our streams in the ground, but that's also where about a third of our fresh water resides. And so making sure that infiltration occurs is extremely important because quite a bit of Maryland does not get its drinking water from reservoirs. It actually gets it from groundwater. And then the little factoid at the bottom from our good folks up north at Environment Canada about the movement of groundwater. Depending upon what material it is trying to flow through, it could be measured in several meters a day. That could be upward to 6 to 10 feet a day. Or it moves only a few centimeters in a century. And I do not do the centimeter conversion, so somebody will have to look that up and drop that in the chat. But groundwater moves depending upon the substrate that it's located in. So then there's urban stormwater runoff. And in the introduction, that's kind of the realm that I and the other watershed specialists work in. There is a lengthy definition. You don't have to try to read it. It's kind of hard to with the background I picked. You will get a copy of this presentation if you want it in a PDF form so you can read it at great length. But the important part is at the end there where the Chesapeake Bay program, and if you're not aware who they are, that is kind of a group of state and federal agencies that are working together within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That's 6 states, the District of Columbia, covering 64,000 square miles, to try to improve water quality in the Chesapeake Bay. And it is overseen by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. They're the ones that set the standards, the way that things are modeled, things like that, as far as how we are progressing and trying to meet bay water quality goals. Unfortunately, other sectors such as forestry, agriculture, wastewater treatment plants have seen great strides in improving the runoff that enters the Chesapeake Bay, and they're decreasing their impact. But urban stormwater is one of the faster growing sources. It's headed in the wrong direction. So again, that's why we're concerned about stormwater or urban stormwater runoff. So this is going to be that little quiz. You're not going to throw it into a Zoom poll. You're not going to throw it into the chat. You can just take a look, and as long as you're on mute, you can like mutter the answers or something like that. And I'm going to just kind of preface this with a couple of things. Number one, we'll get into definitions as we go through, so you're not going to get them in the beginning. And also, I feel that in trying to understand how stormwater moves, it's very important to understand erosion, because erosion is one of those signs that you're going to look for when you step onto a property where there could be misinformation or a lack of information. So first question here, I think we've got 10 different types. Which of the following do you think are erosion, whether it's glacial, splash, coastal sheet, thermal, gully, stream bank, chemical, rill, or wind? And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. Again, you're not going to throw it in the chat or come off and mute and yell it. I guess I could have given you a number 11, which was all of the above. These are all different types of erosion. In fact, there are other types of erosion. that we didn't list. And again, I'll get into definitions as we begin to drill down on some of the more specific ones. So out of those 10, what types of erosion do you think you would typically find in Maryland? I'll give you a couple of seconds. The list hasn't changed since a moment ago. And while you're thinking about it, yes, we do have erosion on the Eastern Shore. That's my family walking down an eroded area on a project. So we do have erosion over here. Okay, so in Maryland, these are the two that we don't get. We don't have glacial erosion, at least not right now, which is just simply a great glacier moving down gradient and grinding rocks into soil. And then the other is thermal, and thermal erosion has to do with heating and thawing of permafrost. So we're not there yet either. So that leaves us the following 8, if my math is correct. And now the question is of the erosion types found in Maryland, which do you think would be associated with stormwater? A couple more seconds. Okay, we've knocked, looks like 3 more out. We're going to focus on splash, sheet, gully, and stream bank, or excuse me, rill. I'm not going to talk about stream bank erosion because if you get called out to a property to help with a problem or do an assessment and you find yourself standing down in a stream, you probably should have had some very specific training or a background in doing that type of work because of it's an extremely dynamic environment, number one. Number two, working in and around streams in Maryland is probably one of the more highly regulated activities, and any recommendation to a landowner could get them in serious trouble with state or federal agencies. So we're going to stay away from stream bank today. Coastal erosion was actually that picture early on of coastal storms, wind-driven waves, battering the coastline, doing erosion to the shoreline itself. Chemical erosion, for those of you from probably Frederick West, know this one through your karst topography where you're going to get sinkholes and you're going to get caverns. And that is the chemical erosion of the soil by the change in the pH and rainwater and groundwater that eats away at the limestone. So that's an example of chemical erosion. And then lastly, wind erosion is one that sometimes you see when a farm field gets opened up. And excuse me, in the springtime, or you see pictures out in the desert Southwest when storms kick up, dust storms. So that would be kind of wind erosion when it occurs. So now we're going to go through, excuse me, these particular 4, and now it gets into kind of the show and tell portion where I'll describe the erosion and give you kind of a little bit of a way when you walk on a piece of property to where to focus to begin to understand where water comes from and where it moves. So the first one is going to be splash erosion, probably in the world of restoration, one of the more famous pictures from USDA of that splash drop, breaking the soil apart and then dislodging it and moving it in different directions. And that's exactly what it is it's that raindrop dislodging the soil particles in the surface. And if you look at that photograph at the bottom with that orange stain on the foundation of the house, you'll notice that it actually goes up pretty high. And where that arrow is about six brick layers up, which by my math is about 18 inches. So the raindrops coming down have a pretty good velocity, and that energy then gets transferred when those soil particles get moved. And so when you're seeing that sort of splash, you know that there's bare soil in the area, or there are gaps in between clumps of vegetation where erosion can begin. And this is where it starts. Splash erosion is where erosion starts. So this is a way that you look for it. You can also look at fences and fence posts. You can look at any kind of vertical structure. Car tires sometimes will have splash erosion on it. And again, it gives you an indication that soil is being dislodged, but you may not be seeing where it has gone at that particular point. And that leads to the next one, sheet erosion. And sheet erosion is just like it sounds. It's like taking a sheet and laying it across the ground. And the water begins to, as the soil can no longer accept it in, begins to move in mass in one direction. It's a very thin layer, quite often less than a quarter inch. And it begins to pick up those dislodged soil particles from the splash erosion, but also because the soil is now saturated and the soil is losing its cohesive properties, it'll pick up a little bit more along the way. And the way that you see sheet erosion, I mean, if you're like in a Walmart or a Target or a Giant Foods parking lot, sometimes you can see that mass migration of water across the parking lot going somewhere, but usually you're not paying attention to it. And what you do is you actually look for the end result. And in the photograph on the bottom there with the yellow arrow, there was an area to the left that was a hillside that was kind of sparsely vegetated. And that's where the sheet flow was occurring. And the water was coming down the hillside and then got onto this parking lot. And what changed was the slope in the parking lot. The slope was less steep, so the water lost velocity. And that velocity was its ability to transport those sand particles. Once the water slowed down, the sand settled out, and you see that result of the sheet erosion. Now, that's not to say that the silt and the clay particles that were in suspension with that water didn't continue on downstream. But this is how you can go out on a sunny day and start looking around, and all of a sudden you can say, there's something in this parking lot. There's something in this flat area of ground that looks as though it wasn't here before. And that gives you the indication to start looking upstream, which was back to that slide with the excavator and the stream is, did something change uphill? And that's where you begin to kind of go in the opposite direction. The next one is real erosion. And these are terms you don't have to memorize or know when you go out in the field, but I'm just going over it in case you get out there and you're like, we're probably in that second or third phase of erosion, and we've got real erosion here. And these are those small rivulets that begin to become noticeable. Some definitions say less than 4 inches wide and 4 inches deep. Quite often you won't see them like that. They'll be much, much smaller. But this is where they begin to dig down into the soil. There's now enough water concentrated in a spot where it's going to start chewing that ground up and creating an area that becomes very noticeable. And what's even more noticeable is the picture down in the bottom is where it deposits. Again, you get a change in slope or a change in channel size allows that velocity to decrease, and then the sandy or the heavier particles will settle out first. And so the arrow on the left there with that really kind of that large rill that is formed, you see the bright sand. But as you get down to the bottom left of the picture, you see kind of that chocolate pudding looking material. That's the silt that is settled out. That doesn't mean that sand, silt, and clay didn't continue on downstream. But this is an easy way to see where there's a change in slope, and you start looking upstream to see where it's coming from and what's causing the erosion. Then the last one, very easy to find and to know what's going on, is gully erosion. This is usually larger than a foot wide by a foot deep. Some have described it that you can't plow through it with a tractor. That would be USDA's definition. And it's a sign that there is a lot of water moving through an area, and these are very difficult to fix, generally take truckloads of soil, sometimes permits because of the amount of work that's involved. But they do a lot of damage. They will do damage to property. The image on the right, they are cutting their way up that hillside toward what looks like a new road. And if they don't take care of that soon, the roadbed will end up being damaged. And the bottom image with the arrow just simply shows you when you get a gully style of erosion like that, the amount of material that has moved is staggering. So this is kind of the end result of all that erosion. It will start as a splash drop, move to sheet flow, then it will go to rill, and then gully. There is a process that it follows. So depending upon where you are in a property, you can get a pretty good sense of we're maybe up towards the head of where the erosion is taking place. So I need to be looking for stabilized areas. I need to be looking for areas where water may be concentrated. So again, those are some of kind of the precursors to stormwater flow and some of the things to look for when you go out on a property. Probably the best way is either to be out on a property while it's raining, and I know that's not always convenient. I know that the National Weather Service doesn't consult with my schedule before scheduling a thunderstorm. But what I will do is I will ask individuals I'm meeting with, do you have photographs of where it's flooding, where the water's coming from? Because that really takes a lot of the misperception and the bias about what's going on. You've got a photograph that says, okay, here's where the water is going. And the one on the left really surprised us. We had no idea that the water was going in under that covered porch and trying to get into their meeting hall over on the left under that bench. Over on the right was about half a day after a heavy thunderstorm. And you can see the water up in front of the vehicle near their garage that ponds in their driveway. There would be some other indications of the flooding that was taking place. But this is a situation where the landowner has just kind of resigned themselves to living with it. And they've dug a small ditch, what we would call a bleeder ditch, going down to the storm drain system into the county right of way. Now, there are ways you can offer suggestions to landowners to try to address excess stormwater runoff. This is one you've got to be very careful about not doing, because depending upon where you live in the state of Maryland, number one, there could be curb and gutter, there could be sidewalks in the way that prevent that from happening. Secondly, you may have very active government agencies or departments that want to know what stormwater is being discharged into their roadway so they can give permission or they can help come up with alternatives. So digging a ditch like that in a more rural area may or may not be a problem, depending upon if it's county-owned road or state-owned road. But this is just something that I normally will not recommend to a landowner, because sometimes it may draw attention to them and a county agency may send them a certified letter telling them to fill it in. Other ways to see stormwater in action is on the right-hand side. Yes, I was pulled over and stopped before I took the photograph, but that photo in that lawn area is a pretty good tool for me to come back after the rain has resided if the landowner is interested in trying to address it, because I can look where those shrubs are, I can look where the edge of the road is, and I can look where that kind of hook-shaped pipe is. Unfortunately, I think that's their septic system that goes underwater. But I can look at those, and then I can stand in that area and begin to look in all directions. I see a house off in the distance. Is that contributing to runoff? Is there runoff coming from a neighbor's property? Is it roadside drainage? Are there pipes? What do you look for in that area? So grabbing these pictures is extremely helpful. The one on the left is a little bit different situation. This was a number of days after the rain had stopped, and I was out doing an assessment on their property. And the water was sitting in three main areas: in the foreground, back towards the shed, and then way off to the left in a wooded area. And I noticed with the front there, you'll notice the downspout on the house. And so my first reaction is yeah, their rooftop and that whole quarter or half of the house is draining into that low spot, and it just can't get out fast enough. And I noticed if you look back towards the shed past the power meter there, you can actually see another downspout that kind of leans in that direction where the water is ponded. But then the area back in the woods was something that had me puzzled. And I think it's a combination of issues here. Number one, I found out later on, very poor soils do not like water soaking into them at all. But also the impervious surfaces, the rooftops, and the road in this particular case were contributing runoff to these areas. And it would sit in her front yard for weeks at a time. And that's why when it would finally dry out, I could go back and see those indications: no vegetation, decaying leaf matter, things like that. And in some cases, I was actually seeing moss growing in her front yard in some of the lower spots. So those are the ways you can go out and kind of get a sense of where the water is going. And then it's your job to start looking around. You pivot 360 degrees and try to say, this is where the water is coming from. I also love to do kind of that desktop analysis. This is using Google Earth. At the top of the picture is a project we're currently working on, but there's flooding on the other side of the road that had an impact. And I was able to go back, I think it's 16 years ago, and look at the aerial photograph in 2008. And what we saw was there was a heavy rain that occurred, and in the farm field, when they'd cut the soybean crop, they left the chopped up stubble in the field. They got a heavy rain that floated, and then the wind came in and pushed the soybean stubble to one end. So I'm able to see kind of that line of where the extent of the flooding was. And you'll notice there's two areas, one kind of in the middle there and then one off to the right. And then if you look at, 10 years later, I'm still seeing indications that something's happening in that area. I'm noticing that the crops in that area are kind of stunted when they took the photograph. That could be a sign of, maybe too much or not enough fertilizer. Was there the chance that, their cedar ran out or something like that? I don't know. But for it to align with an area that floods frequently, and I'm seeing a little bit darker soil, I'm kind of seeing the footprint of an area that floods. And then lastly, off to the right, 2024, just this past fall, I notice a darker soil color. Now, again, that could have been right after a rain and the soil is saturated and will change colors, but that's also an indication of flooding. So I'm able to go back and use these photographs to try to find one that helps me pinpoint where it's floods. And again, it could be these kind of like bathtub ring sort of marks, or it could be a discoloration in the soil. Now, there are other ways that you can see where stormwater has been, and we're going to take these 3 photographs, run through them, kind of dissect them a little bit. So, you get, we'll call them stormwater eyes, for lack of a better word, that when you go out on a property, you can look around and say, I think I know what's taking place here. So the first one, you can take a look and see here that there are signs that organic matter has been removed. You're down to the bare soil. That there is debris that was moving downstream that got snagged on maybe a small root sticking up or a weed or something like that. And then you look for signs that grass or other vegetation has been laid over, and where it's pointing is the direction that the water it was going. So here's a couple of examples. Again, the organic matter is gone. You've got these areas where materials jammed up, including on the bottom, the posts on that bench, but then also where vegetation has been laid down. And what I do when I see something like this, I literally stand right in the middle and I start walking up the hill. I start walking up the direction it was coming from and looking. Is it coming from 2 or 3 directions, or is there a main flow area? The next picture, this is one where if you're in a more urbanized area or an area without a lot of change in elevation and you think you see where a channel might be, what I would do is I would squat down real low to the ground so you can see those minor differences. And you may actually notice that there is a channel that is formed, or the area is actually graded intentionally to move water. It may have a gradual V or a very, very shallow U shape. You'll also notice there are areas where the small channel may be starting to erode. Again, debris has been removed, stones may have been exposed, and you'll find bare soil areas. And that's exactly what you're seeing in this particular picture here. This is in the town of Oxford, and this is what I do. I walk out and I start looking, and I'm like, okay, I see where the channel is forming, and I'll go back one. So you can see that area where there is a little bit less vegetation, a little bit darker area that catches your attention. But again, I'm not talking the stones being exposed down there by the metal grate on the storm drain system, those large river jack stones. I'm talking smaller ones just upstream a little bit that have been pressed into the soil over the years that are now being exposed and are visible. And then lastly, debris line. I showed you that in those farm field photographs. This is kind of the bathtub ring that you look for. And if you get something like this, it just makes your day so much simpler in trying to figure out where water is coming from and where it's going. In a manicured lawn, sometimes the only sign may be that the cut grass, the dead grass, is what forms the flow channel, or you kind of see where it's built up and created that debris line. But it could also be mulch, twigs, or it just could be sediment-laden water that shows you where things have moved. And I've got just a couple more examples of this. This was a fire station not far from where I live in northern Talbot County. I drove by during a very intense thunderstorm, and I knew that the county was receiving complaints from the landowners. So by the time I got back after a meeting, the water was gone, and I was like, oh man, I missed my chance. But then I started walking around, and there it was in one side of the road up in the parking lot. You can see that debris line, and in somebody's front yard, I could see it as well. And by getting some measurements, figured out that there was about 15 inches of rain standing in that intersection. Now, for a fire truck, they can move right through something like that. But this time of year, when it begins to ice up, that becomes very problematic for emergency responders and vehicles in general. So here's another one of those great little segue pictures. So with this one, I would actually say all 3 apply, depending upon you're not wanting to get wet. I don't think you're going to let the dog out. But I would say that C is probably the most applicable, what I would call the kind of 24-hour rule. And so for those of you that were reading left, I'm going to play this video again when it stops. This is somebody pouring some water onto a newly completed, here it goes, newly completed porous asphalt parking. anyway, go out, help somebody try to reduce their stormwater problems. You know, are there simple things to do, you know, such as redirect downspouts? Can they use a rain barrel? Can they replace their sidewalk driveway or something like that? Take it from an impervious surface to using something permeable, whether it's pavers or some other sort of system. There's concrete and things like that that they can use, and that helps reduce the amount of runoff. Now, redirecting downspouts, there's a couple of caveats with that that we'll hit in a minute. But this example where they're trenching their downspouts, they're probably headed to roadside drainage. I will tell a landowner, you know, if you want to extend your downspouts away from the foundation to avoid getting water in your crawl space or your basement, go ahead. But running them all the way out to some sort of roadside drainage system or a neighbor's property, again, is a recipe for getting attention that the neighbors may not want. So you always got to consider things as you go out with the recommendation. Also, soils. Soils are a wonderful best management practice when they can be used. If you're on a piece of property and the soils look like they may be pretty good to help with stormwater, do they just need a little bit of remediation? Maybe some deep tillage, the adding of some compost, using native plants with the conservation landscaping BMP, their deep roots help keep water moving down into the soil, things like that. Or is it good enough for a rain garden? Again, we're not going to go into finding out that soils information tonight. Maybe they'll invite me back later. Nor am I going to say how to size one or locate one. But, you know, is a rain garden an opportunity to help utilize the existing soils? And again, here's the caveat, 24 to 48 hours. That picture that you saw previously where it showed the flooding in the backyard, I didn't see anything that said emergency danger. I saw a problem for a landowner. I saw an inconvenience. I saw a lot of things like that. I didn't see a generator. I didn't see an above ground gas tank or anything like that that may have been causing an emergency situation. So usually, you know, if somebody says I'm getting flooding, you know, it's 24 to 48 hours before we should really think about reacting, because it could have been a very, very heavy thunderstorm move through that's kind of out of the norm before you really need to take action. Now, if in a situation where the water is there after that time period, then you start looking around for impervious surfaces, pipes, which are sometimes difficult to find. And I would really be suspicious of the soils. I would begin to think that maybe the soils, there's either a compacted layer or they're just soils that do not allow water to infiltrate well. This is one where when you go out to do stormwater and you make recommendations, know the limits of your training. If you get into a situation where a landowner is really pushing for a rain garden, they really want one, and it's going to be one of those designs that requires a pipe underground and it's got to be hooked into the existing storm drain. At that particular point, I would step back and say, it's beyond what I've been trained to do. You need to contact an engineer, a landscape architect, or a professional that's done that sort of thing. You know, it's just something that you don't want to make a recommendation that the landowner implements, and then there are major problems later on. The county may not let them tap into the existing storm drain, and they've got this large hole in their ground and a bunch of pipes sitting on a pallet in their front yard. So definitely understand that there are times that you have to bring experts in, and I do it all the time. The number 5 there, you know, if a landowner calls you out and you walk out and, you know, you see erosion around pipes, water jumping across roads, or going into buildings, especially livable structures, they need to call and report that. That is an emergency situation that's threatening property or life. And you don't need to be there and say, hey, I'll send a text to so-and-so. Let the landowner deal with it. And let them report it to the appropriate agency to make sure that they're aware of it, because they may have to respond to that situation a little bit later. And then number 6 is just kind of these cautionary caveats. I don't know what other words to describe it with, but don't push, dump, redirect, or alter the flow of water onto someone else's property. Maryland has a relatively specific law that talks about upstream and downstream landowners. And what you don't want to do is tell a landowner to throw a couple sandbags or a load of dirt into a ditch to block the water because their neighbor, they said, put in, a large patio and now they're flooded out. Conversely, they may have done something that has an impact downstream, and that needs to be addressed between landowners. And so you can see that little summation of the law. It's one sentence, but it's the best, most concise way to look at it. That upstream landowners cannot increase the flow of water onto downstream landowners. That doesn't mean that water didn't always go there. If they increase the volume of it, then they've got an issue. Stacy, I see your hand.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to relay a question that came in to me from Margarita. Who do you
Can
call
I
in these
hold?
cases?
It depends on what county you're in. I start with maybe the Public Works Department, or I'd say that's probably the best one. Sometimes it's the Roads Department. County websites, municipal websites will have information. But if we could save the questions to the end, I'd like to try to get through this because I may actually answer some of them or not. But that was a good question, and we'll loop back to it at the end if that wasn't sufficient. Anyway, you do not want to alter the natural flow of water. And I'll be honest with you, there are landowners out there that don't like conflict or don't like their neighbors, and they may try to get somebody to do their dirty work for them by saying, hey, you put that patio in, you need to fix it because you're flooding this person out. You don't want to put yourself between two property owners because it takes a lot of time, and I've been doing it for 30 years, and sometimes it ends up in court. So we have this fact sheet here. The link will be provided to you at the end of all this. I would download a copy of that fact sheet. It describes how two landowners that have a stormwater issue can work together to solve the problem. Unfortunately, it realizes that people don't always work together, and then it goes into how to document and prepare yourself to go to court. So this is just something that if you've got this upstream, downstream landowner situation, be very, very careful about what's recommended and what you're asked to do. So here's another segue. I think we're getting very close to the end. This is my little transition to best management practices. And I would say all three of these apply. I love the genius behind these little rain buckets and the way cool downspout and how it all works. But if you were a neighbor, you may think that maybe belongs in the Museum of Modern Art or something like that. But beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But anyway, we're going to transition into best management practices. These are a little bit larger than what we usually deal with. These are designed by professional engineers and installed by contractors, not homeowners. And they're designed to either temporarily store water or allow it to soak in to the soil. And they use plants in the process. And sometimes they do store it temporarily and allow it to soak in. So practices will do a number of different, BMPs, best management practices, will do a number of different things in ways that they will hold and then get rid of their storm water. Things you have to consider. We talked a little bit earlier about slope and how fast water can move downhill. It does the same thing along with infiltration, is getting that water into a best management practice. If you've got a steep slope, more water is going to get down there faster, probably faster than it can allow it to soak in. So you do have to consider slope. And in fact, a couple of them that I'll show you in a minute actually have slope guidance, or at least one of them has slope guidance on it. And the same with drainage area. Large areas generally will have more runoff. Now you could have a large forested watershed draining to an area that may not have much runoff at all. But in more urbanized areas, chances are you're going to have those impervious surfaces that may overload best management practice. So the goal is try to get as close to the source as possible. If the landowner is trying to address rooftop runoff, don't do like the picture in the bottom right and put it in the roadside ditch outside of the property, because there's a chance that it's going to be overloaded. And you may miss other things, utilities, there may be other areas draining to it that weren't considered. So those are two factors that you really need to think about when you move into contemplating the use of small or residential scale BMPs, as we refer to them. And the first one, the first quiver or arrow in our quiver, is rain barrels. And these are just simply above ground storage containers, generally hold about 50 gallons of water. That water is temporarily held into them until it can be discharged either into a bucket so they can water other plants, or it's allowed to flow out slowly into an pervious surface, landscape bed, something like that. We don't just want to open the spigot and let it run back down the driveway. That doesn't do any good. That just picks up more pollutants. And this is some of the criteria to consider. It is a best management practice. It's recognized by state and federal agencies as such. So there is a drainage area limit for it. So, when you go in, you need to think about things. How are they going to connect it? Where does the water go? How are they going to use the water? Regular maintenance of it. If you have people that are elderly or with a disability and they've got to go and winterize a rain barrel, you need to talk to them about that. Do they have somebody that may be able to help them? Because this may not be the best management practice for them. Also, certain communities may have covenants and restrictions to the use of rain barrels. So you need to make sure that it's okay before you start giving guidance to someone to do it. Also, there's that little caveat. Do not direct runoff onto neighboring properties. I think you're going to see that at least a couple more times. Rain garden is the Cadillac of the best management practices. Everybody wants one, but they're not always right for every site. Basically, aside from this fancy definition, it's an excavated area where runoff from impervious surfaces directed so that it can soak into the ground and be utilized by plants. The design that we work with normally is only 6 inches deep. It'll only have 6 inches of standing water in it at any time, and that's as a safety factor, so you don't have to worry about people getting in it. And here's some of the guidance. Again, there's a drainage area consideration for it. You'll notice down there about halfway down, there is the slope consideration for it. You can use the native soils as long as it's a hydrologic soil group A or B. I'm kind of working backwards on this. I hope this is not confusing y'all too much, but at least I'm not reading them. You also have to consider, are there local requirements? Did you do the infiltration test? Desire line I'll hit on in a minute with another BMP. Where the water is coming from. Is it full sun? Is it shade? You never put them under a tree because of roots, different things like that. And the key to a rain garden is setbacks. You can't put them up against a building. You need to be 10 feet away. There are setbacks from septic and from wells. Now, for those of you in the more urban areas, Howard, Prince George's, Montgomery County, if you're on central water and central sewer, this is less of a consideration. If you're down in Calvert County, maybe out in Western Maryland or on parts of the Eastern Shore, most people are on individual well and on septic systems. So there are setbacks that really make it difficult to locate a rain garden on a small piece of property. There's that warning again, do not direct that onto neighboring properties, and it needs to drain within 24 to 48 hours or everybody's money has been wasted. You're going to drown the plants and you're going to invite mosquitoes and lots of phone calls because somebody's going to want somebody to come out and fix it because it's not working. So you always have to go into these with a lot of forethought and a lot of preparation and doing an assessment before you just drop a rain garden in. Rooftop redirect, this is a simple one, not necessarily a Bay approved best management practice, but it's a way you can take downspouts like on the left that normally just flow down the driveway and into the road and turn them off into a grass area under the caveat that it's not going to flood somebody else out at the other end. The only thing you really need to do is just monitor it for erosion at the end, and you can do that with one of the prefabricated splash blocks, or you can utilize some rock at the end. And you don't want to confuse that with the actual Bay-approved BMP. I'm not going to go into this one, but rooftop disconnection is very difficult to meet in most existing residential areas. And so this is something that the designers do in the early phase to try to take advantage of flowing water across open ground. But to meet this one is extremely complicated. But you'll get a copy of the guidance here when you get a copy of the presentation if you want to look into that a little bit more. Also, my email is at the end if you have questions. Last one I'm going to hit on, and I think we'll wrap up with enough time for Q&A, and I can stay here all night if you want. But conservation landscaping. This is using native grasses, shrubs, wildflowers to create planted areas that help to improve water quality. Runoff can be directed into them. The reason that it's native grasses, it is a Bay-approved best management practice. Also, a lot of the funders will require that native plants be used. And this is an area through using the plants, breaking the soil up, their deep roots, help with infiltration, but also create some way cool habitat. And considerations, again, native plants You want sheet flow only. If you put it into a ditch or a swale where a lot of water moves, first thing that's going to leave is the mulch. Second thing will be the soil. The third thing, it'll be plucking plants out and they'll end up downstream. So you do not want to put them in areas of concentrated flow. And I'd mentioned desire line. If you all have been talked about this before, that's where people want to walk. So if you put this in between two sidewalks, let's say, and they use it as a shortcut, I guarantee you they'll use your rain garden or your conservation landscaping as that same shortcut. When the plants have been pruned back, they're just going to walk right through it. So do consider where people move as you go through a property. These are going to be some resources you can look at. So we can get to the Q&A here. And these are great resources for mapping tools, environmental layers, as well as soils information. I want to thank you all for everything that you do. As volunteers for University of Maryland Extension, you are the extra set of eyes, ears, hands that help get things done and make Maryland such a great place to live. And with that, now we can go to questions, and I'm going to stop sharing at this point. That was a lot. That was fast. You can put that in the evaluation. They've been 10 years.
Thanks, Eric. That was really fantastic. We just learned so much from you so fast. There are a few questions in the chat, and then I see Bernard has his hand up. Let's start with his first question from Adrian. Lots of compliments too in the chat box. How effective are pervious pavers in your opinion?
So pervious pavers are very good at reducing surface runoff. In fact, what they're able to do is take a driveway and completely eliminate the runoff that's caused by them. The thing is there's certain things, criteria that has to be met. They can't be sitting over the water table. You need an area of the soil underneath, and they generally require a gravel layer underneath. But when they are used, they are a wonderful best management practice.
Great. And I see, Bernard, you have your hand up. Can you go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Certainly. Thank you. Eric, great presentation. Thank you. Eric, I know you're involved in, Water Stewards Academy and
I didn't recognize your name, Bernard.
Yeah, I usually go by Danny, my middle name, but yeah, so that might have confused you. And as you know, I've been trying for a few years to get such a course at Cecil County. But rather than continue to wait, are there courses in other counties that are related courses in other counties that one could tap into maybe remotely and still bring that capability back to Cecil County?
So send me an email afterwards. I think you've got that contact information. Hartford already has one going, and I don't know about the other counties, but send me an email and we'll try to connect you to that.
Thank you.
So there was an earlier comment, but we can sort of ask it as a question too. Thomas said, hopefully king tides and coastal flooding will be discussed along with saltwater inundation on residential property. Nobody seems to address this, but it's a major issue for the Eastern Shore. So I just wondered if that would be a part 2 follow-up or a wholly different set of issues, Eric.
So I'm going to throw my coworker, Dr. Kaylee Krieg, under the bus. You're going to invite her back to talk about those very projects. She is our coastal climate specialist. I will say that it is an issue, especially on the Eastern Shore, and people are aware of it and action is moving. The legislature asked the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology right across the hall from where I'm at to begin looking at sea level rise and saltwater inundation. Also Dr. what's her name? Jackie K. What's her name? Not Brubaker, but there is a researcher on the Eastern Shore that is studying that very specific issue. So it is on everybody's radar that works in the coastal climate resilience realm. I usually try to stay feet dry. So I'm above high tide. And yeah, the king tide is a very interesting phenomenon. And that's one where when I go out for coastal visits, I try to ask landowners to get pictures of that. And I will put in a shameless plug for something called the My Coast app, where you can record stormwater flooding as well as coastal issues if you want. Then if somebody reminds me later, I'll send you the link to it because it's a pretty cool way to document and share with others what's happening in your community.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and that was the My Coast app, Eric?
Yep,
My
yep, all
Coast
one
app?
word. Yeah, MYCOAST. Maryland DNR runs it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I was trying to get a citizen or community science app as spotlighted in each one of these
Yeah.
presentations. So we got it, the My Coast
If
app.
if you reach back out to me, we can try to find out who within DNR is running it, because they may come in and do a special training for how to use it and things like that, and who can access the data on the back end.
Okay, super. We've got time
Yep.
for one more question. Um, if you don't have, well, actually, there are two that are pretty good here and
They're
probably
fine.
pretty quick. If you don't have room for a rain garden, can putting native plants in a foundation planting help? Do you mean around a foundation, like around a foundation of a house, or Trisha?
Yeah,
That was from
if they could just clarify.
Let's give Patricia a minute to come off of mute. Let's go to this one other question and then we'll come back to Patricia. Um, Linda asks, can you use pervious pavers on a slope?
I believe that there is slope criteria from the State Department of the Environment. What you want to really be careful of when using the pavers is that they want to be as level as possible, and that's what allows the water to stand up during the heavy rain and then seek those gaps in between and soak in. And if you slope it, you begin to push that water away. The other thing about slope is you may have a hillside that drains down to it, and if that is not stabilized extremely well, you can get a load of sediment that will flow in and it will fill in all those little cracks and crannies, kind of like the Thomas English muffin, fill it up, and water won't get down through it and you waste your investment. So flat is good, and stabilized around it is extremely good.
And I would say this is probably a job for a certified pervious paver installer. There are contractors that have certifications in that
Yep.
area. You do want to get someone who knows what they're doing.
Yes.
Otherwise, like you said, you're going to be throw away a lot of resources, or trying to do it DIY. You may not get what you're striving for.
Certainly DIY can be used in places that I can't recommend. If a landowner wants to go ahead and do that. And I would suggest that if you're looking for certified contractors, you start with the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program that we help to create and continue to support. And they have a list of contractors that know what they're doing.
And thank you so much, Eric. And that last question from Patricia, yes, she was asking about foundation plantings around a home foundation. So if you can't, if it's not a good place to put a rain garden, it's too close to the house, could you still get benefit from doing native plantings around the foundation of the house?
Yeah, so conservation landscaping is the go-to. In places there's not a rain garden, you can do conservation landscaping about anywhere. There's always the caveat about working right up against the foundation and plants getting up, air circulation, the chance for maybe mildew, things like that. You may have a greater chance of finding out where your cable line is buried if you start digging down, things like that. But conservation landscaping is the go-to when I meet a landowner and they're like, I really want a rain garden and I hate to pop their bubble, but their soils are no good, or there's some other reason the utilities around it won't allow it. I'm like, but we can do conservation landscaping. And their eyes light up and I'm like, it's a rain garden without the low spot is really what it is. And they get excited.
I love it. Thank you so much. What a great presentation. I'm going to pass it back to Jackie. Thanks to everybody for all your great comments and questions in the chat box.
Happy holidays. Yeah.
So I want to remind everybody, I've put it a couple times in the chat, the website link to where you'll be able to find this recording and Eric's presentation, the PowerPoint. I will also make sure that I will put a link to My Coast there, as well as a link to the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professionals group, which is where you can find those landscapes. Also, I will also put that fact sheet on, how to talk with your neighbors about stormwater issues. So we will put all that on there, and then we will also the new list that Stacy introduced at the beginning of the presentation today. We will start populating that so you can go ahead and start registering for next year's seminars. So with that, I'm just like to say good night to everybody and happy holidays to everybody, and hope everybody gets a little bit of downtime.
Thanks, everyone. Good night. Bye,
Thank you
Jackie. Bye,
all.
Eric.
Appreciate
Bye,
the invitation.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Happy holiday.
Jackie, Stacy, do you want me to send you the just the PDF version of